The banging on the door came before the sun had fully risen, and Clara Bennett knew before she opened her eyes that something terrible was about to happen. She heard her father's voice, low and shaking, and then the heavier voice of a stranger, cold and official. She pulled a shawl around her shoulders and crept to the top of the stairs, and what she saw below made her stomach twist into a hard knot. Two men in dark coats stood in the hallway, papers in their hands, while her father backed away from them with his palms raised, as though he could push the words back into their mouths. "There must be some mistake," he was saying. "Give me a fortnight. Give me a month." "There is no more time to give, Mr. Bennett," the taller of the two men said. "The court has ruled. The debt stands at £412, and it will be paid, one way or another." Clara's hand tightened on the banister. £412. It was a number so large it did not feel real, like a figure from a fairy tale, rather than something that could touch her own life. She had known, in a vague and frightened way, that her father's business had been struggling. She had seen the letters piling up on his desk, had noticed how he flinched whenever a knock came at the door, but she had never imagined it would come to this, men standing in their front hall at dawn, speaking of ruin as though it were already settled. Her father turned, and his eyes found her on the stairs. For a moment, something passed over his face, something that might have been shame, or might have been the beginning of a decision he did not want to make. He did not call her down. Instead, he turned back to the men and said words that Clara would remember for the rest of her life, though at the time she could not fully understand their weight. "Take my daughter," he said. "There is a provision in the law. If the estate cannot answer for the debt, a member of the household may stand as surety. Take her instead." The room seemed to tilt. Clara gripped the banister so hard her knuckles turned white. She waited for someone to object, for her father to laugh and say it was a jest, for her mother to come rushing from the back room and put a stop to this madness. But her mother did not come. Her mother, Clara would later learn, was already awake, already dressed, already sitting very still in the parlor, with her hands folded in her lap, refusing to look toward the hall. "Sir," the shorter of the two men said, glancing up the stairs at Clara, "this is an unusual request." "It is within the law," her father said again, and his voice did not waver this time. "She is unmarried. She has no children, depending on her. The debt is mine, but the estate is in her name as much as it is in mine, left to her by her grandmother. Let her answer for it, and let me keep what remains of my trade, so that I might one day repay what is owed." Clara descended the stairs slowly, as though moving through water. She did not scream. She did not cry. She only asked, in a voice so quiet she barely recognized it as her own, "Father, what are you saying?" He would not meet her eyes. "It is only for a short while, Clara. A matter of weeks. I will find the money, and you will come home. I promise you that." She wanted to believe him. She searched his face for some sign of the man who had once carried her on his shoulders through the market square, who had taught her to read by candlelight, who had called her his clever girl. But the man standing before her now seemed like a stranger wearing her father's coat, a man who had already made his choice long before the men in dark coats arrived at the door. The taller man stepped forward with a folded paper in his hand. "If you will sign here, Mr. Bennett, the matter can proceed." Clara watched her father take the pen. She watched his hand shake, just slightly, as he pressed it to the paper. And she understood, in that moment, that her fate had already been decided, somewhere far away from this hallway, in the quiet arithmetic of debts and estates and laws that valued a daughter's freedom no higher than a stack of coins. "You cannot mean this," she said, and now her voice was rising, cracking at the edges. "I have done nothing. I owe nothing." "The law does not ask what you have done," the shorter man said, not unkindly. "It asks only what can be paid." Her mother appeared in the parlor doorway at last, her face pale and drawn, but she said nothing. She only looked at Clara with an expression that might have been grief, or might have been relief that it was not her own name on the paper. Clara searched for her sister, Margaret, and found her standing at the top of the stairs in her nightgown, one hand pressed to her mouth, saying nothing either. No one in that house was going to stop this. Clara understood that with a clarity that felt like ice water poured down her spine. "You will need a coat," the taller man said, almost gently. as though this small courtesy might soften what was happening. "It will be cold where you are going." Clara turned and walked back up the stairs, on legs that did not feel like her own. In her room, she stood before her small wardrobe and stared at her dresses, her shawls, the modest collection of things that had made up her quiet, unremarkable life. She chose her warmest cloak and a plain wool dress, and she packed a small bag with a comb, a handkerchief, and the one book she owned that she could not bear to leave behind, a worn copy of poems her grandmother had given her. When she came back down, her father would not look at her. Her mother pressed a small purse of coins into her hand, whispering, "For food, for kindness, where you can buy it," and then stepped back, as though Clara were already a stranger, already someone who belonged to a different world. The carriage that waited outside was plain and unmarked, and the two men helped her into it with a courtesy that felt almost cruel in its politeness, as though good manners could make right what was so plainly wrong. As the carriage pulled away, Clara looked back at the house where she had lived her whole life, at the window of her own room, at the door that had closed behind her without her father ever stepping outside to say goodbye. The streets of London passed by in a blur of gray stone and gray sky. Clara sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, trying to steady her breathing, trying to convince herself that this was some strange dream from which she would soon wake. But the jostling of the carriage over cobblestones was too real, the cold seeping through her cloak too real, the silence of the two men across from her too real. "How long," she finally asked, "does a person usually stay in such a place?" The shorter man glanced at her with something like pity. "That depends on the family, miss. Some are out within the week. Others—" He did not finish the sentence, and his silence told her more than words could have. They passed through streets that grew narrower and darker, where the houses leaned toward each other, as though sharing secrets, where children in ragged clothes watched the carriage pass with hollow eyes. Clara had read of such places in novels, had passed them at a distance on rare occasions when her family's carriage took a wrong turn, but she had never imagined she would arrive at one as a resident rather than a passer-by. The carriage stopped before a high wall of dark brick, topped with iron spikes that caught what little light the morning offered. A heavy gate stood at its center, and above it, carved into stone, were words that Clara would come to know far too well. She did not read them aloud. She did not need to. The weight of the building itself told her everything the words might have said. "This is the place," the taller man said, stepping down and offering her his hand. Clara did not take it at first. She sat frozen in the carriage, staring at the gate, at the small barred window set into the wooden door beside it, at the guard who emerged from a little booth with a ring of keys at his belt. Everything in her wanted to refuse, to demand they turn the carriage around and take her back home, to insist that this was all some terrible misunderstanding that would be corrected the moment someone with authority looked at the situation properly. But there was no one to appeal to. Her father had signed the paper. Her mother had pressed coins into her hand instead of arguments into the men's ears. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a decision made by people who loved her, or who had once loved her, or who had decided that whatever love they held for her mattered less than the shape of a debt. She took the man's hand and stepped down from the carriage. The guard at the gate looked her over with the practiced eye of someone who had seen every kind of person pass through, from hardened debtors who had grown used to the place, to frightened young women like herself, arriving for the first time with no notion of what awaited them inside. "Name," he said, not unkindly, but without warmth either. "Clara Bennett," she said, and her voice, to her own surprise, did not shake. "Surety for Edmund Bennett," the taller man confirmed, handing over the folded paper. "Debt of £412. The guard glanced at the paper, then at Clara, then made a small mark in a ledger that hung from a chain at his side. "Come along then, miss. No use standing in the cold." The gate groaned open, and beyond it Clara saw a courtyard of packed dirt, surrounded by high walls on every side, and beyond that, the looming shape of the ward itself, a building that seemed to swallow whatever light touched it. Figures moved in the courtyard, thin and stooped, wrapped in whatever rags they could find against the cold. Some looked up as she entered. Most did not bother. "Wait," Clara said suddenly, turning back toward the two men from her father's house. "Please. Tell my father I am well. Tell him I am waiting for him." The taller man's expression softened. just slightly. "I will tell him, miss." But even as he said it, Clara understood that he did not believe her father would come soon, if he came at all. She watched the carriage door close, watched the horses turn, watched the only connection she still had to her old life pull away down the narrow street and disappear around a corner. The guard touched her elbow, not roughly, but firmly enough to remind her that she had no choice but to move forward. "This way," he said. "I'll show you where you're to sleep." Clara took one last look at the gate behind her, at the sliver of ordinary street still visible through the gap before it swung fully shut, at the last glimpse of a world where people came and went as they pleased, where debts were the business of adults in offices rather than the whole of a young woman's existence. Then the gate closed, with a heavy, final sound, and Clara Bennett turned to face whatever waited for her inside the debtors' ward, telling herself, because she needed something to hold on to, that her father would come for her soon, that this was only for a short while, that surely, someone who loved her would not let her stay here for long. She did not yet know how wrong she was. The guard led her across the courtyard, past thin figures who watched her with dull curiosity, the particular look of people who had long ago run out of energy for anything sharper than curiosity. The ground was hard and uneven beneath her thin shoes, and the air carried a smell she could not quite place, something between damp stone and unwashed cloth and old smoke. "You'll want to keep your bag close," the guard said over his shoulder. "Things go missing here if you're not careful. Not everyone inside these walls is honest, though I'd wager most started out that way, same as you." Clara said nothing. She was still trying to make sense of the courtyard, the walls, the strange half-world she had been delivered into. They passed a well where two women stood drawing water, their conversation dying away as Clara approached, their eyes following her with an expression she could not read, pity perhaps, or simple weariness at the sight of yet another new arrival. The guard stopped before a heavy wooden door set into the main building. "This is the women's ward. You'll find a spot to sleep, and Mrs. Farrow will see you're settled. Mind you keep out of trouble, and trouble will mostly keep out of you." He pushed the door open, and Clara stepped through into a long, dim room lined with narrow cots, some occupied, most simply bare frames waiting for the next person unlucky enough to need them. The air inside was thick and close, and somewhere near the far wall, a child was crying, a thin, exhausted sound that seemed to have been going on for hours. Clara stood in the doorway, her bag clutched against her chest, and for the first time since the men had knocked on her father's door that morning, she felt the full weight of what had happened to her, not as an idea, not as words spoken in a hallway, but as a place, a smell, a sound, a door closing behind her. This was where she would sleep tonight. This was where she would wake tomorrow. This was, unless something changed, unless someone came, the whole of her world now, 412 pounds standing between her and everything she had once called her life. She took a breath, straightened her shoulders the way her grandmother had once taught her to do when facing anything frightening, and stepped further into the room, because there was nothing else left to do but go forward. A scream tore through the ward before Clara had even chosen a cot to call her own, and every woman in the room froze at once, the way animals freeze when they sense a predator nearby. Clara spun toward the sound and saw a thin woman near the far wall struggling against two others who were trying to pull something from her hands, a small tin cup, worn and dented, but clearly precious to her. "Give it back," the thin woman cried, her voice raw. "It is all I have of him." Clara's heart pounded. She did not know these women, did not know the rules of this place, but something in her would not let her simply watch. She stepped forward before she had fully decided to, her voice sharper than she expected it to be. "Leave her be." The two women who had been pulling at the cup turned toward her, sizing her up with the quick, assessing look of people who had learned to measure threats and opportunities in an instant. One of them, broad-shouldered with a scar through her eyebrow, took a step toward Clara. "And who might you be, to give orders in here?" Clara's mouth went dry, but she did not step back. "Someone who thinks a cup is not worth the trouble you're making." For a long moment nothing happened, the broad-shouldered woman staring at Clara as though deciding whether she was worth the effort of a fight. Then, to Clara's surprise, an older woman near the door spoke up, her voice carrying the weary authority of someone who had been in this ward far longer than anyone else present. "Enough, the both of you. Mrs. Farrow will have you both on bread and water for a week if she hears shouting again." The name seemed to work like a spell. The broad-shouldered woman released the tin cup with a last contemptuous glance and stalked off toward her own cot, muttering under her breath. The thin woman clutched the cup to her chest, tears streaking through the grime on her face, and gave Clara a small, grateful nod before retreating to a corner. The older woman who had intervened approached Clara now, studying her with sharp, tired eyes. She was perhaps 50, with gray hair pulled back severely and hands roughened by years of hard use. But there was something steady in her expression, something that suggested she had not yet let this place take everything from her. "New, are you?" she said. It was not really a question. "This morning," Clara said. "My name is Clara Bennett." Agnes Miller. The woman studied her a moment longer. "You've spirit, stepping between Bess Caro and anyone. Most new arrivals spend their first day too frightened to speak at all." "I don't know the rules here," Clara admitted. "I don't know anything about this place." "Then you'd best learn quickly, or this place will teach you in ways you won't enjoy." Agnes gestured toward an empty cot near her own. "That one's free. The girl who had it was released last week, paid off by a cousin in trade. You can have her spot if you want it." Clara looked at the narrow frame, the thin straw mattress, the single gray blanket folded at its foot, and something in her chest tightened at the thought that this was to be her bed now, in place of the soft feather mattress she had slept on every night of her life until this one. But she nodded, because there was nothing else to do, and set her small bag down beside it. "Thank you," she said, "for helping me, and for the bed." Agnes waved this away. "Don't thank me yet. There's little kindness free in a place like this, but I've found it easier to bear the days if I keep some scrap of decency about me. You'll find your own way of managing, or you won't, and either way this place doesn't much care which." Over the following hours, Clara began to understand the shape of her new existence in fragments, the way one learns a foreign language by scattered words rather than whole sentences. There was a bell that rang at dawn, calling the women to a cold breakfast of thin gruel, served in the courtyard. There was a fee, small but constant, charged for a marginally better cot, for slightly cleaner water, for candles after dark, so that even within the ward, poverty had its own cruel hierarchy, the desperate preying gently upon the more desperate. "How do people ever leave?" Clara asked Agnes, as they sat together that first evening, sharing a heel of bread Agnes had produced from some hidden fold of her clothing. "Someone pays," Agnes said simply. "A family settles the debt, or a creditor decides the fight isn't worth the cost of keeping a person locked away producing nothing. Some work off small sums doing mending or washing for the guards' families. Most simply wait and hope, and wait some more. And if no one pays, and there is no work to be had?" Agnes did not answer right away. She looked toward the small barred window high on the wall, where the last gray light of the day was fading. "Then you grow old here, Clara Bennett, or you don't grow old at all. I've seen both happen more times than I care to count." Clara wrapped her arms around herself, though the evening was not yet truly cold. "My father said it would be a matter of weeks." "They all say that," Agnes said, not unkindly, but with the flat honesty of someone who had heard the same hopeful words 100 times before, spoken by 100 different new arrivals. "Sometimes it's true. Sometimes the family scrapes together the coin quicker than expected, ashamed of the scandal more than moved by love, and out you go before the month is out. Other times—" She did not finish the sentence, but Clara understood the shape of what she was not saying, understood it the way one understands the outline of a shadow, even without seeing the object that casts it. That night, lying on the thin straw mattress with the gray blanket pulled up to her chin, Clara stared at the dark ceiling and listened to the sounds of the ward around her. Someone coughing in a corner, someone else murmuring in their sleep, the distant sound of a guard's boots on stone outside. She thought of her own bed at home, of the soft candlelight her mother used to leave burning in the hallway, of her father's voice reading aloud from the newspaper after supper. All of it felt impossibly far away now, as though it belonged to a different Clara entirely, a girl from a story rather than a life she had actually lived. She told herself, as she had told herself all day, that this was temporary, that her father would find the money, that within a fortnight or a month, she would walk back out through that iron gate and never think of this place again, except as a strange and frightening memory. She held on to that thought the way a drowning person holds on to a piece of driftwood, not because it was sturdy, but because it was all she had. The days that followed fell into a grim rhythm. Clara learned to rise at the bell, to eat the thin gruel without complaint, to keep her small store of coins hidden carefully in the hem of her cloak, for she had already seen what happened to those who displayed their resources too openly. She learned which guards could be reasoned with, and which were best avoided entirely. Learned the particular cruelty of Mr. Corbin, the wardmaster, who took evident pleasure in reminding the women of exactly how small and powerless they were within these walls. "You there," he said to her on her third day, his eyes moving over her in a way that made her skin crawl, though he never did more than look and speak. "Bennett, isn't it? Merchant's daughter, I hear. Fallen rather far from your fine house, haven't you?" "I am here because my father chose it," Clara said, keeping her voice steady, though her hands trembled at her sides. "Not because of anything I have done." Corbin laughed, a short, unpleasant sound. "None of you did anything, to hear you tell it. Funny how the ward fills up with so many innocent souls." He studied her a moment longer, something calculating in his expression. "Still, you've a bit more polish than most who pass through here. Perhaps that will serve you, or perhaps it will only make the fall feel sharper. We shall see, Miss Bennett. We shall see." He moved on to torment someone else, and Clara let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Agnes, standing nearby, touched her arm gently. "Best to keep your eyes down around him," she murmured. "He likes to see people flinch. Give him nothing to enjoy, and he tires of you quicker." Clara nodded, filing the advice away with the growing collection of small survival lessons she was learning. Lessons no one at home had ever thought to teach her, because no one at home had ever imagined she would need them. A week passed, and then another. Clara wrote letters to her father, careful, measured letters that did not accuse him of anything, that simply asked after his health and inquired, as gently as she could manage, whether there had been any progress toward settling the debt. She gave the letters to a guard, who, for a small fee, agreed to see them posted. She waited each day for a reply, with a hope that grew more fragile with every silent morning. She thought often of her sister Margaret, 3 years older, and recently married to a Mr. Hollis, a man of modest but respectable means who had seemed, before all of this, genuinely fond of Clara. Surely Margaret would intervene. Surely a sister's love would not simply vanish because a debt collector had knocked on a door. She held on to this hope the way she held on to the thought of her father finding the money, turning it over in her mind each night before sleep, polishing it like a small stone until it gleamed bright enough to hold back the darkness pressing in from every side. She did not yet know that hope, in a place like this, could be as dangerous as despair, that it could keep a person waiting long past the point when waiting had any use at all. But for now, in those first weeks, hope was what she had, and she clung to it with both hands, because the alternative was to look clearly at where she was and understand, in full, exactly how alone she had become. The letter arrived on a wet Tuesday morning, and Clara knew from the way the guard held it, almost reluctant to hand it over, that something was wrong before she had even broken the seal. She recognized her sister's handwriting immediately, the careful, looping letters Margaret had always been so proud of, and for one bright moment, her heart lifted with the thought that rescue had finally come. She opened it with trembling fingers, standing near the courtyard well, where the light was better, and read it twice, before the words fully settled into meaning. Margaret wrote of her new husband's family, of his mother's delicate constitution, and how any scandal touching the family name might undo her fragile health entirely. She wrote of her husband's position in society, of the invitations they had recently received to dine with families of real consequence, families who would surely withdraw their friendship if word spread that Mrs. Hollis had a sister languishing in the debtors' ward. She wrote, in careful, apologetic sentences, that somehow managed to say a great deal while admitting to nothing, that she could not visit, could not write again for some time, and hoped that Clara would understand that this was, in its own way, a kindness, sparing her the added burden of watching her sister's ruin unfold alongside her own. Clara read the last line 3 times. "I am certain Father will see to matters soon, and until then, I think it best we do not correspond, for both our sakes. For both our sakes." Clara folded the letter with hands that had gone strangely steady, the way hands sometimes go steady in the moment just after understanding arrives, before the grief has fully caught up to the mind. She stood by the well for a long while, the letter pressed flat against her palm, watching the gray water ripple whenever the wind moved across its surface. Agnes found her there some time later, still standing in the same spot, and did not need to ask what had happened. She had seen this particular stillness in enough new arrivals to recognize it instantly, the moment when hope for a family's rescue quietly died, and something harder, more solitary, took its place. "Bad news," Agnes said, not a question this time. "My sister says it is best we do not correspond," Clara said, and her voice came out strange and flat, as though she were reporting someone else's misfortune rather than her own. "For both our sakes." Agnes was quiet for a moment. "I had a sister once who said something similar, though she dressed it up in prettier words. It's a common enough thing, in places like this. Families discover very quickly how thin their love runs, once it's tested against their own comfort. My father promised it would only be a matter of weeks. And has he written since?" Clara shook her head slowly. She had sent 4 letters now. She had received none in return. That evening, Clara sat apart from the others, turning the tin cup Agnes had lent her over and over in her hands, without drinking from it, her mind circling the same question again and again. What had she done, in her whole quiet, obedient life, to deserve so little loyalty from the people who were supposed to love her most? She could not think of a single unkindness, a single act of disobedience, a single moment that might explain why her father had offered her up so readily to settle his debt, why her mother had pressed coins into her hand instead of arguments into the collector's ears, why her sister now wrote of scandal and delicate constitutions as though Clara's suffering were merely an inconvenient rumor to be managed. The answer, she slowly came to understand, was that she had done nothing at all. It was not about what she had done. It had never been about that. It was only about what was convenient, what was easiest, what cost her family the least. She was the unmarried daughter, the one without a husband's protection, the one whose absence from society would be noticed by the fewest people. That was the whole of the calculation that had decided her fate. Days blurred together after that. Clara stopped writing letters. She stopped watching the gate each morning for a carriage that might carry her father's face. She began, instead, to learn the ward the way Agnes had learned it, the small economies of survival, which guard could be persuaded to overlook a minor infraction for a coin, which corner of the courtyard held the least wind in the evenings, how to make a heel of bread last through 2 meals instead of 1. Mrs. Farrow, the woman who oversaw the day-to-day running of the women's quarters, took a cautious interest in Clara, perhaps because Clara's manner of speech and bearing marked her as different from most who passed through the ward. "You read well, I'd wager," Mrs. Farrow said one afternoon, finding Clara with her grandmother's book of poems, one of the few possessions she had managed to keep hidden through the various small thefts that plagued the ward. "I do," Clara said. "There's a woman in the far corner, old Mrs. Pratt, who can no longer see well enough to read her son's letters when they come. She'd pay a small coin, I think, for someone to read them to her, and to write her replies. It was not much, but it was something, a small purpose in the long gray stretch of days, and Clara took to it gladly. Reading Mrs. Pratt's letters gave her something to think about besides her own circumstances, and the coins she earned, however few, gave her a small measure of the independence that had been stripped from her the moment the men in dark coats knocked on her father's door. But even as she built these small routines, the weight of her situation never fully lifted. She watched women around her grow thin and gray with the slow erosion of hope, watched others develop the hard, brittle edges that came from too many years inside these walls. She saw a woman named Hetty, who had entered the ward pregnant and given birth within its cold rooms, watched the infant grow pale and quiet, in a way that frightened Clara more than anything else she had witnessed since her arrival. "Does no one help them?" Clara asked Agnes one evening, watching Hetty rock her infant with a kind of desperate, exhausted tenderness. "Surely there is some charity, some church, some soul, willing to see a child does not suffer for its mother's debts." "There are charities," Agnes said. "There are church societies that visit sometimes, bringing blankets or a bit of bread. But charity is a slow and uncertain thing, Clara, and debt is a swift and certain one. The two rarely move at the same pace." Clara thought of this often in the weeks that followed. the strange mathematics of a world where cruelty moved quickly and mercy moved slowly, if it moved at all. She thought of her father's business associates, men of some wealth who might, with a single stroke of a pen, have settled the debt and spared her all of this. She thought of the Hollis family's fine house, of the dinners Margaret now attended with people of consequence, of how easily a fraction of that comfort might have purchased Clara's freedom, and how instead it was being spent to purchase the family's continued respectability. Corbin, the wardmaster, seemed to sense the shift in Clara over these weeks, the way she had grown quieter, more careful, less inclined to meet his eye. He took a particular pleasure in reminding her of it. "Not so quick to argue your innocence these days, are you, Miss Bennet?" he said one morning, pausing near her as she carried water back from the well. "I expect you've realized by now that innocence has very little bearing on how long you stay in a place like this." Clara said nothing, kept her eyes down as Agnes had taught her, and continued on her way, though she felt his gaze linger on her back long after she had passed. It was on one of the coldest evenings of that stretch, when frost had begun to creep along the edges of the courtyard well, that Clara first became aware of being watched by someone other than the guards and her fellow prisoners. She could not have said, at first, what alerted her to it, some small prickling sense at the back of her neck as she crossed the courtyard toward the women's quarters. She glanced up and saw, near the outer gate, a tall figure in a dark greatcoat, standing perfectly still, watching the courtyard with an intensity that seemed out of place among the guards' usual bored indifference. She could not make out his features clearly in the fading light, only the impression of height, of stillness, of a gaze that seemed, for one strange moment, to settle directly upon her, before moving on to survey the rest of the yard. By the time she blinked and looked again, he had turned to speak quietly with one of the guards, and a moment later he was gone, passing back through the gate into whatever world existed beyond these walls. She thought little of it at the time, assuming him some official come to inspect the ward's conditions, or perhaps a relation visiting another prisoner. It did not occur to her, that evening, that she had just glimpsed, for the very first time, the man whose quiet decision would one day change the entire course of her life. She only knew, as she lay on her narrow cot that night, that for one strange moment in the gathering dusk, she had felt seen in a way she had not felt seen since the day the gate had first closed behind her, and she could not have said, even to herself, why that feeling lingered so long after the stranger had disappeared. Nathaniel Ashworth, Duke of Rendale, had not meant to look at any single face among the wretched crowd inside the debtors' ward, and yet once his eyes had settled upon the young woman with the straight back and careful steps, he found he could not entirely look away. He had come that evening on business that had nothing to do with her, a private inquiry into the conditions of a ward his own solicitor had flagged for its unusually high mortality among the women's quarters, a matter he intended to raise, quietly and without fanfare, with the appropriate magistrate. He had not expected to find himself distracted by a single figure crossing a muddy courtyard with a bucket of water. There was something in the way she carried herself, he thought as his carriage pulled away from the ward's outer gate, that did not belong to this place. Not pride exactly, though there was a measure of that too, but something more like discipline, the visible effort of a person determined not to let her circumstances reduce her to less than she had been. He had seen despair in that courtyard, plenty of it, etched into faces gone slack with exhaustion. He had not expected to see anything like resolve, he told himself, as the carriage rattled through the darkening streets toward his own townhouse, that it was no concern of his, one more unfortunate soul among the hundreds who passed through such places every year. He had larger matters occupying his attention, a seat in the Lords that required careful tending, an estate in the north that had suffered a difficult harvest, a mother who wrote weekly letters urging him to consider marriage before he grew, in her words, too settled in his solitary habits to make a decent husband to anyone. He had no business dwelling on the face of a stranger, glimpsed for a few seconds, across a prison courtyard. And yet he found himself, 3 days later, asking his steward, Mr. Pruitt, a quiet and capable man, who had served the Ashworth family for the better part of 2 decades, to make certain inquiries. There was a young woman in the ward, the Duke said, without quite meeting Pruitt's eye, as though the request embarrassed him in some way he could not fully articulate. Dark-haired, perhaps 20 years of age, carrying herself with more composure than the place seemed to warrant. I should like to know her circumstances. Pruitt, who had long ago learned not to question his employer's occasional unusual requests, simply nodded. I shall see what can be discovered, Your Grace. It took Pruitt only a few days to return with an answer, for the records of such matters, however grim, were kept with meticulous care by the courts. Her name is Clara Bennett, Your Grace, daughter of Edmund Bennett, a merchant whose trading concerns collapsed some months past under a debt of £412. Rather than face debtor's prison himself, Mr. Bennett invoked an old provision allowing a surety from among the household and put forward his unmarried daughter in his stead. The Duke sat very still at his desk, absorbing this information with a growing sense of quiet anger that surprised him with its intensity. He had encountered a great many forms of human weakness in his years of managing his own estates and observing the affairs of others, but there was something particularly ugly in a father offering his own daughter to a debtor's ward rather than face the consequence of his own failures. And has the family made any effort to secure her release? None that the records show, Your Grace. She has been in the ward some 6 weeks now, with no visits and, as far as my inquiries could discover, no correspondence beyond a single letter from a married sister declining to maintain contact for fear of scandal. The Duke set down his pen and looked out the window of his study toward the grey London sky, thinking, not for the first time, of his own younger sister, dead these past 8 years, whose final months had been marked by a different kind of family abandonment, a slower, quieter cruelty that had haunted him ever since. He had been abroad when it happened, occupied with matters he could no longer even properly recall, and by the time word reached him of how thoroughly his own mother had turned her back on Eleanor's suffering, there had been nothing left to do but grieve and regret. He had promised himself, in the years since, that he would never again stand by while someone was abandoned by those who ought to have protected them, not if it was within his power to act. It was a promise he had kept quietly, through a handful of discreet interventions over the years, debts settled anonymously, positions found for the destitute through intermediaries who never revealed the true source of their good fortune. He had no wish for recognition in these matters. Recognition, he had come to believe, too often turned charity into performance, and he wanted no part of performing virtue for an audience of admiring peers. £412, he said aloud, more to himself than to Pruitt. Yes, Your Grace. See that it is settled, quietly. I do not wish my name attached to the transaction in any way that might trace back to me. Use the usual arrangement, through Whitmore's office, with the payment recorded simply as coming from an unnamed benefactor. Pruitt, who had handled several such quiet arrangements over the years on the Duke's behalf, nodded without surprise. I shall see to it directly, Your Grace. Might I ask, if it is not presumptuous, what has drawn your particular attention to this case? You have settled debts before, but rarely have you asked me to look so closely into the circumstances first. The Duke considered the question for a long moment, turning his pen over in his fingers. I am not entirely certain, he admitted finally. There was something in the way she carried herself, even there, even in that place, that I found I could not simply forget. Perhaps it was nothing more than a passing impression. But I find I cannot rest easy, knowing a young woman sits abandoned in that ward, while I have the means to correct it, and choose not to. Pruitt said nothing further on the matter, though privately he noted, with the quiet observation of a man who had served his master long enough to recognize the small shifts in his moods, that the Duke's interest in this particular case seemed to carry a weight beyond his usual charitable impulses. He kept this observation to himself, as was his habit, and set about the business of arranging the payment. There remained, however, a complication that Pruitt raised with some hesitation a few days later, when he returned to the Duke's study, with news that troubled the straightforward simplicity of the plan. There is a difficulty, Your Grace. It appears Mr. Bennett's debt was not owed to a single creditor, but had been sold, in part, to a man named Silas Grant, a merchant of uncertain reputation, who deals in the purchase of troubled debts at reduced prices, gambling that the desperation of debtors' families will eventually yield a profit through negotiated settlements. Grant holds perhaps a third of the total sum now, and he has, according to my sources, taken a particular interest in seeing the debt collected in full, believing the Bennett name still carries enough remaining credit among certain circles to make a public collection embarrassing enough to squeeze additional funds from distant relations. The Duke frowned. meaning he would rather see the family suffer publicly than accept a quiet settlement. Precisely, Your Grace. Men like Grant profit as much from scandal and pressure as from the debts themselves. A quiet, anonymous payment may not satisfy him, if he believes there is more to be extracted through continued suffering. The Duke was silent for a long moment, weighing this new complication against his determination to see Clara Bennett freed without any trace of his own involvement. He had not anticipated that simple generosity might require careful strategy, that a man's greed could complicate even the straightforward act of settling a debt. Then we shall need to be more careful in how this is managed, he said finally. Find out everything you can about this Silas Grant, his habits, his associates, his particular vulnerabilities. If he intends to make a difficult business of this, I intend to be prepared for whatever difficulty he offers. Very good, Your Grace. And Pruitt, the Duke added, as his steward turned to leave. Not a word of this reaches my mother, or anyone in society. Whatever is done for Miss Bennet must remain entirely unknown to her and to everyone else. I will not have her freedom purchased at the cost of her dignity, made into gossip for drawing rooms to pick over. Of course, Your Grace. As always, discretion above all else. Left alone in his study, the Duke found his thoughts returning, unbidden, to the image of Clara Bennett crossing that muddy courtyard, her back straight despite everything, her steps careful and deliberate, as though she refused to let the ward's degradation touch the essential core of who she was. He did not yet know her, not truly, beyond a name and a brief impression glimpsed across a prison yard, but he found himself determined, with an intensity that surprised him, to see her free of that place, whatever complications Silas Grant might choose to introduce, and to do it in a way that asked nothing of her in return, not even her knowledge of who had made it possible. It was, he told himself, simply the fulfillment of an old promise made to a sister he could no longer help. It had nothing to do with the particular color of a stranger's eyes, glimpsed briefly across a darkening courtyard, or the particular way she had squared her shoulders before stepping back into the shadow of the ward. He told himself this several times over the following days, and found, each time, that he believed it a little less. Silas Grant proved, exactly as Pruitt had warned, to be a man who did not release his grip on a profitable debt without a fight. When Whitmore's office first approached him with an offer to settle his portion of the Bennett debt in full, quietly and without fanfare, Grant's response arrived within 2 days, brief and pointed enough to make his intentions plain. I find the offer curious, Grant wrote to Whitmore, in a letter the solicitor promptly forwarded to Pruitt, coming as it does from an unnamed party, with no apparent connection to the Bennett family. I confess I am rather more interested in learning who wishes this debt settled than in the settlement itself. Until such time as I understand the nature of this sudden benevolence, I find myself disinclined to release my claim, and indeed, I have begun making inquiries of my own into whether the remaining Bennett relations, however distant, might be persuaded to contribute further sums before I consider the matter closed. Pruitt brought this letter to the Duke with visible concern. He suspects there is more to be gained by patience than by acceptance, Your Grace. And worse, his inquiries into the Bennett relations may stir precisely the kind of public attention we have been working to avoid. If word spreads that distant cousins are being pressed for funds on Miss Bennett's account, questions will follow about why the matter has suddenly become urgent again after so many weeks of silence. The Duke read the letter twice, his jaw tightening with each pass. He means to use my own discretion against me. The quieter I attempt to make this, the more curious he becomes. And the more curious he becomes, the more he digs. And the more he digs, the greater the risk that my name surfaces in connection with hers, before the matter is settled. That is my reading of it as well, Your Grace. The Duke rose from his desk and paced the length of his study, his mind working through the problem with the same careful attention he brought to matters of estate management and parliamentary strategy. He had faced difficult men before, in business and in politics, men who mistook another's discretion for weakness rather than what it truly was, a choice rather than a limitation. Grant deals in troubled debts because he believes desperate families will always eventually pay more than the debt is worth, to escape the shame of public collection, the Duke said slowly. His entire business rests upon patience and pressure. If we cannot outlast his patience through a simple offer, we must remove his ability to apply pressure at all. How do you propose we do that, Your Grace? Find out who else Grant owes money to. A man who trades so aggressively in others' debts is rarely free of his own obligations. If we can locate a creditor of Grant's own, someone with a claim urgent enough to require his immediate attention, we may find him considerably more amenable to a quick, quiet settlement that frees his capital, rather than tying it up in a prolonged and uncertain negotiation. Pruitt's expression showed the particular respect he reserved for moments when the Duke's strategic mind proved sharper than his own. I shall make inquiries immediately, Your Grace. It took the better part of a week, conducted through a careful network of solicitors and men of business who owed the Ashworth name various quiet favors, but Pruitt eventually returned with exactly the information the Duke had hoped to find. Silas Grant, it emerged, had overextended himself considerably in a recent venture involving imported silks, and owed a substantial sum to a shipping concern that was, at that very moment, growing impatient for payment. The shipping concern is owned by a Mr. Aldous Whitfield, Pruitt reported, a man of considerable means, but limited patience for delayed payment. He has, according to my sources, already sent 2 letters demanding settlement within the month, threatening legal action should Grant fail to comply. The Duke's expression sharpened with interest. Then, Mr. Grant finds himself in precisely the position he has spent his career placing others, does he not? Pressed for funds, facing the threat of public embarrassment should his own debts become known within the circles he trades among. It would appear so, Your Grace. Arrange for Whitmore's office to approach Grant once more, but this time with a different offer entirely. Not merely a settlement of the Bennett debt, but a private loan, extended anonymously through Whitmore, sufficient to satisfy his obligation to Whitfield's shipping concern, on the sole condition that he relinquish his claim to the Bennett debt entirely, and signs an agreement never to pursue any further action against the family, or against Miss Bennett in particular. Pruitt considered this a moment. A generous offer, Your Grace, though it will cost considerably more than simply settling the original £412 outright. The cost is of no concern to me, the Duke said, and there was a firmness in his voice that closed the matter entirely. What concerns me is that Miss Bennett be freed cleanly, without any lingering claim that might resurface to trouble her in future, and without any trail that might lead back to my own name. If solving Grant's difficulty solves ours as well, then the additional expense is a small price for certainty. The offer, delivered through Whitmore's careful hand within days, achieved precisely the effect the Duke had anticipated. Silas Grant, faced with the prospect of his own public embarrassment before Whitfield's shipping concern, accepted the terms with considerably more haste than he had shown in his initial correspondence, signing away his claim to the Bennett debt entirely in exchange for the private settlement of his own obligations. It is done, Your Grace, Pruitt reported some days later, laying the signed documents upon the Duke's desk. Grant has relinquished his portion of the debt entirely, and the remaining sum owed to the original creditor has been settled in full through the arrangement we discussed previously. Miss Bennett's name has been formally cleared from the ward's records as of this morning. The Duke examined the documents carefully, satisfaction settling over him like a weight finally lifted. And there is nothing in these papers, nothing at all, that might trace the payment back to Ashworth House? Nothing, Your Grace. The transaction runs entirely through Whitmore's office, recorded as coming from an anonymous benefactor, with no further identifying detail. I have made certain of it personally. Good. Then see that word is sent to the ward that Miss Bennett is to be released, and arrange for suitable transportation to collect her. I do not wish her to walk the streets alone and unprotected after so many weeks confined. Pruitt hesitated, choosing his next words with visible care. Might I ask, Your Grace, what is to become of Miss Bennett once she is released? She has, as I understand it, no home to return to, given her family's evident abandonment of her cause. Without further arrangement, I fear she may find herself in circumstances nearly as precarious as those she is leaving. The Duke had, in truth, already given this matter considerable thought in the quiet hours since first learning of Clara Bennett's situation. I have arranged for a cottage on the edge of the Ashworth estate at Kendrick, currently unoccupied, to be made ready for a companion position to my aunt, Lady Ashworth's sister, who has long expressed a wish for someone to assist her with correspondence and small household matters in her advancing years. The position will be offered through my aunt's own household, with no indication whatsoever that I have had any hand in arranging it. Miss Bennet need only believe she has secured honest employment through ordinary channels, nothing more. A carefully constructed arrangement, Your Grace. It must be carefully constructed, the Duke said. I have no wish for Miss Bennet to feel herself an object of charity, dependent upon a stranger's whims for her continued survival. Let her believe she has earned her position through honest work, and let her build whatever life she chooses from there, free of any debt to me that might otherwise weigh upon her pride. Pruett bowed slightly, recognizing in his employer's careful arrangements the particular blend of generosity and discretion that had marked his charitable efforts for years, always given freely, always concealed thoroughly, always structured so that the recipient's dignity remained fully intact. I shall see to the arrangements at once, Your Grace. Left alone once more, the Duke allowed himself a rare moment of quiet satisfaction, though it was tempered by an awareness that the true difficulty of his plan had perhaps only just begun. He had freed Clara Bennet from the ward. He had secured her a position that would allow her to rebuild some semblance of an ordinary life, but he understood, even as he made these arrangements, that a woman abandoned so thoroughly by her own family would carry the wounds of that betrayal long after the physical chains of debt had been lifted, wounds that no quiet payment, however generous, could fully heal. He found himself wondering, as he had wondered several times over the preceding weeks, what manner of woman Clara Bennet truly was, beyond the brief impression he had formed watching her cross a muddy courtyard weeks before. He would likely never know, he told himself. His arrangements had been constructed precisely so that their paths need never cross again, so that she would remain forever unaware of the stranger who had quietly rewritten the course of her fate. It was, he reminded himself firmly, exactly as he wished it to be. And yet, as he turned back to the ordinary business of his day, he found the thought of Clara Bennet lingered with him still, a small and stubborn presence he could not quite set aside, no matter how thoroughly he tried. The guard's voice calling her name that morning did not sound like the beginning of anything good, and Clara's stomach clenched with old, practiced fear as she rose from her cot and made her way toward the ward office, expecting some new hardship, some further reduction of the small comforts she had managed to build for herself over the past weeks. Bennet, Mr. Corbin said, looking up from his ledger with an expression she could not quite read, something between surprise and grudging respect. It seems your debt has been settled in full. You are to be released this morning. For a moment, Clara simply stood there, certain she had misheard him. Released, she repeated, the word strange and unfamiliar in her mouth, as though it belonged to a language she had once known, but had nearly forgotten. That is what I said. Someone has paid the sum entirely, both your father's original debt and the portion held by a Mr. Grant. You are free to go, Miss Bennet, as of this hour. Clara's mind raced, grasping for some explanation that made sense. My father, she said. Has my father found the money at last? Corbin consulted his ledger again, though Clara suspected he already knew the answer, and was simply enjoying, in his particular way, the small drama of delivering it. The payment came through a solicitor's office, recorded only as an anonymous benefactor, no family name attached whatsoever. An anonymous benefactor, Clara repeated, the words making even less sense than the word released had a moment before. But who would pay such a sum for someone they do not know? That is not a question I am equipped to answer, Miss Bennet, nor one I have any particular interest in pursuing. What matters is that your debt is cleared, and you are free to leave these walls. I would suggest you gather your things before someone changes their mind, mine included. Clara returned to the women's quarters in a daze, her thoughts tumbling over one another too quickly to settle into any coherent shape. Agnes met her at the door, having already heard the news through the quick, efficient gossip network that ran through every corner of the ward. You're being released, Agnes said, and there was genuine warmth in her expression, though Clara also caught, beneath it, the particular wistfulness of someone who had watched many others walk free while she herself remained behind. I don't understand it, Clara said, gathering her few belongings with hands that trembled slightly. No one has told me who paid, or why. My father did not do this. My sister has made her feelings on the matter quite clear. I know no one else who might have such means, or such reason to spend them on my behalf. Does it matter who, so long as you are free? Agnes asked, though her tone suggested she understood perfectly well why it mattered a great deal. It matters to me, Clara said. I do not like owing a debt to a stranger, any more than I liked owing one to my own family's creditors. Agnes helped her fold her few remaining items into her small bag, the same bag Clara had carried into the ward all those weeks before, though it felt different now in her hands, heavier somehow with everything that had happened since. Perhaps you will learn who it was, in time. Perhaps you will not. Either way, Clara Bennett, do not waste this gift wondering too long about its source. Take your freedom, and build something worth having with it. Clara embraced Agnes then, feeling a lump rise in her throat at the thought of leaving behind the one person who had shown her genuine kindness through the worst weeks of her life. I will not forget you, she said. The moment I am able, I will find some way to help you, and Hetty, and her child, whatever it takes. See that you do, Agnes said, though her voice was thick with emotion, despite the lightness of her words. And Clara, whoever this benefactor is, they saw something in you worth saving. Try to remember that, on the days when you doubt your own worth, someone, somewhere, believed you deserved better than this place. The walk across the courtyard felt entirely different from the one she had made on her first frightened morning weeks before. The gate that had once seemed a symbol of everything final and terrible now stood open before her, and the guard who unlocked it did so with a briskness that suggested he had performed this particular task many times, though never, Clara suspected, for someone whose gratitude ran quite so deep. Outside the walls, a plain but well-kept carriage waited, and a driver in modest livery stepped forward to open the door for her. Miss Bennett, I am to convey you to Whitmore's office, where certain arrangements have been made regarding your future position. Clara climbed into the carriage in a state of continued bewilderment, watching the debtors' ward recede behind her through the small window, half expecting the whole experience to reveal itself as some elaborate dream from which she would soon wake, still trapped inside those cold walls. Mr. Whitmore, when she arrived at his modest but respectable office, proved to be a courteous older gentleman who explained matters with the careful, measured tone of a man well practiced in delivering complicated news gently. Your debt has been settled in full, Miss Bennett, by a benefactor who wishes to remain entirely anonymous. I am not at liberty to reveal any further details regarding their identity, as this was an explicit condition of the arrangement. But surely there must be some way to thank them, Clara said, some acknowledgement, however small. The benefactor has specifically requested none, Whitmore said gently. They wish only for you to consider the matter closed, and to move forward with your life free of any sense of obligation. However, I have been asked to inform you of a position that has become available, should you wish to consider it. Lady Beatrice Ashworth, residing at Kendrick, seeks a companion to assist with correspondence and household matters. The position comes with modest but respectable wages, comfortable lodging, and a household of good reputation. I understand from my inquiries that Lady Beatrice is a woman of pleasant temperament, if somewhat particular in her habits, and the position would represent, I believe, a stable and honorable path forward for someone in your circumstances. Clara sat very still, absorbing this new turn with the same disorientation that had accompanied every development since she had woken that morning. And this position, too, comes through the same anonymous benefactor? I could not say, Whitmore replied, with the careful evasiveness of a man who knew a great deal more than he was permitted to share. I was simply asked to inform you of the opportunity, should you wish to pursue it. The choice, of course, remains entirely your own. Clara considered her circumstances with the clear, unsentimental practicality that her weeks in the ward had taught her. She had no family home to return to. Not truly, not after her father's betrayal and her sister's cold retreat into respectability. She had no means of her own, beyond the small remaining coins her mother had pressed into her hand weeks before. Coins that would not sustain her for long, in a city as expensive and unforgiving as London. I will accept the position, she said finally. I have nowhere else to go, and I would rather earn my keep through honest work than remain dependent on the charity of strangers, however generous their intentions. A sensible decision, Miss Bennett, if I may say so. I shall arrange for your transportation to Kendrick within the week, once suitable accommodations along the road have been secured. As Clara left Whitmore's office that afternoon, stepping out into a London street that felt strange and overwhelming after so many weeks confined behind high walls, she found herself turning the mystery of her benefactor over and over in her mind. the way she had once turned over the small tin cup Agnes had lent her, searching for some clue, some explanation, that made sense of a stranger's inexplicable generosity. She thought of the tall figure she had glimpsed at the ward's gate weeks before, the dark greatcoat, the stillness of his posture, the sense of being watched by someone whose attention felt different, somehow, from the guard's usual bored indifference. She could not say with any certainty that the two things were connected, the stranger at the gate and the anonymous benefactor who had settled her debt. But the thought lodged itself in her mind regardless, refusing to be dislodged, a small persistent question she carried with her as she prepared to leave London behind and begin whatever new life awaited her at Kendrick. Whoever this benefactor was, she owed them a debt far greater than the coin itself, a debt of freedom, of dignity restored, of a future that had, only that morning, seemed impossibly distant. She did not know, as she packed her few belongings that evening in preparation for her journey, that the answer to this mystery would find her again in time, in circumstances she could not yet begin to imagine, nor that the stranger who had rewritten her fate would soon become far more central to her life than either of them currently understood. Lady Beatrice Ashworth proved, exactly as Whitmore had promised, to be a woman of pleasant, if particular temperament, and Clara settled into her new position at Kendrick with a swiftness that surprised her, given how thoroughly her previous weeks had taught her to expect misfortune around every corner. The cottage where she lodged, small but clean and warm, felt like a palace compared to the narrow cot she had grown accustomed to in the ward, and the work itself, managing Lady Beatrice's correspondence and assisting with small household matters, engaged her mind in ways that helped push back the darker memories that still surfaced, unbidden, in quiet moments. "You write a fine hand, my dear," Lady Beatrice observed within her first week, examining a letter Clara had drafted on her behalf. "And you have a sensible manner about you that I find refreshing. My previous companion had a tendency toward nervous flutter that I found rather exhausting." "Thank you, my lady," Clara said, though privately she wondered whether Lady Beatrice knew anything at all of her circumstances, of the ward, of the strange anonymous kindness that had delivered her to this position. If Lady Beatrice knew, she gave no sign of it, treating Clara with the same brisk, cheerful practicality she seemed to bring to every aspect of her life. The weeks at Kendrick passed in a gentler rhythm than any Clara had known since her father's business first began to crumble. She walked the estate grounds in the mornings, finding a measure of peace in the quiet countryside that London's crowded streets had never offered. She read to Lady Beatrice in the evenings, managed her correspondence with a diligence that earned genuine praise, and slowly, carefully, began to rebuild something resembling a sense of her own worth, separate entirely from her family's judgment or abandonment. Yet even as this new life took shape, Clara could not entirely shake the persistent question of her mysterious benefactor, nor the unsettling sense, which grew stronger rather than weaker with time, that someone connected to that kindness remained nearby, watching over her progress from some careful distance. It was at the harvest gathering held each autumn, at the main house of the Kendrick estate, that Clara first encountered the Duke of Rendale directly, though she did not, in that first meeting, recognize him as anything other than a distinguished guest among the many gathered for the occasion. Lady Beatrice had insisted Clara attend, despite her modest position within the household. "Nonsense," she said, when Clara protested that a companion had no proper place among such gatherings. "You are practically family to me now, my dear, and I shall not have you moping in the cottage, while everyone else enjoys the festivities." The main hall of Kendrick blazed with candlelight that evening, filled with the particular warm chaos of an autumn celebration, tenants and gentry mingling in a rare display of seasonal goodwill. Clara stood somewhat apart from the main crush of guests, feeling out of place among silks and jewels that recalled, uncomfortably, the world she had once belonged to before her family's collapse. "You look as though you would rather be anywhere else," a voice said beside her, deep and unexpectedly warm, and Clara turned to find a tall gentleman regarding her with an expression of genuine curiosity, rather than the polite disinterest she had grown accustomed to receiving from strangers of higher rank. "I confess I am not entirely accustomed to such gatherings any longer," she admitted, before some instinct of caution made her add, "though the hospitality has been most generous." Diplomatically said. He studied her a moment, with an intensity that made her strangely aware of her own posture, her own hands folded before her. Nathaniel Ashworth. I have some connection to this estate, though I confess, I do not spend nearly enough time here as I ought. Clara Bennett. I have the honor of serving as companion to Lady Beatrice. Something flickered across his expression at her name, gone so quickly that Clara could not have said with any certainty what it had been. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition, though she could not imagine why either would apply. Miss Bennett, he said, recovering smoothly, my aunt speaks very highly of you. She tells me you have brought a great deal of order to her correspondence, which I confess, has needed ordering for some years now. Lady Beatrice is a generous employer, Clara said. I count myself fortunate to have found such a position. They spoke for some time that evening, longer than Clara would have expected given the difference in their stations, and she found herself surprised by how easily conversation flowed between them, how genuinely he seemed to attend to her opinions on the books she had been reading to Lady Beatrice, on the small observations she offered about the estate's autumn beauty. There was something in his manner that put her curiously at ease, despite his evident rank, a quality of genuine attention that felt entirely different from the careless condescension she had occasionally encountered from gentlemen of similar standing. You have a way of observing things closely, he said at one point, as they stood near a window overlooking the darkened gardens. It is not a common quality, in my experience. Most people look without truly seeing. Perhaps I have simply learned, through certain experiences, that it does not pay to look away from difficult things, Clara said, and something in her own words surprised her with their unintended honesty. What experiences would those be, if I may ask? His tone was gentle, without any hint of prying curiosity. And yet Clara found herself hesitating on the edge of confession, some instinct urging her to trust this stranger with a piece of her history she had shared with almost no one at Kendrick. Difficult ones, she said finally, choosing caution over the strange pull toward openness that his attention seemed to invite. I would rather not dwell on them this evening, if you do not mind. Of course, forgive my curiosity. He studied her a moment longer, something unreadable moving behind his eyes, and Clara had the distinct, unsettling impression that he understood far more about her difficult experiences than she had actually revealed, though she could not imagine how such a thing might be possible. Their conversation was interrupted before either could pursue it further by the arrival of another guest, a woman named Mrs. Caldwell, who greeted Nathaniel with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance and drew him away toward a group gathered near the fireplace. Clara watched him go with a strange sense of loss she could not fully account for, given how briefly they had spoken and how little, in truth, she actually knew of him. It was Lady Beatrice, later that evening, who first mentioned his full title, and Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach at the revelation. You were speaking with my nephew for quite some time, Lady Beatrice observed, with the particular knowing look of an older woman who missed very little. The Duke of Rendale does not usually spend so long in conversation with anyone at these gatherings. He finds most social obligation rather tedious, I'm afraid, though he hides it well enough for politeness' sake. The Duke, Clara repeated, her mind racing back over their conversation, searching for any sign she might have missed, any clue to a rank so far above her own modest position. I had no idea. He introduced himself simply as Nathaniel Ashworth. That sounds precisely like him, Lady Beatrice said, with obvious fondness. He has never cared much for the trappings of his title, though he carries the responsibilities of it more seriously than most men of his rank. A good man, my nephew, whatever his occasional stubbornness. Clara turned this new information over carefully in her mind that night, lying awake in her small cottage bed, replaying their conversation with fresh understanding of exactly how far above her station the man she had spoken with so easily actually stood. She thought of the strange flicker of recognition that had crossed his face at her name, the careful attention he had paid to her words, the sense she had felt, throughout their entire exchange, of being truly seen rather than merely observed. A suspicion began to form in her mind, faint and uncertain at first, but growing steadily stronger the longer she considered it. Could it be possible, she wondered, staring up at the dark ceiling of her small room, that the Duke of Rendale and her anonymous benefactor were somehow one and the same person? The thought seemed almost too fantastic to entertain, and yet she could not entirely dismiss it either, not after the particular quality of his attention that evening. Not after that unmistakable flicker of recognition at the mention of her name. She resolved, as sleep finally began to claim her, that she would watch for further signs, further clues, however small, that might confirm or dispel this growing suspicion. She did not yet know how soon those clues would begin to accumulate, nor how complicated the truth would prove to be, once she finally uncovered it in full. The proof, when it finally came, arrived not through careful observation, but through pure accident, the way important truths sometimes do, arriving sideways when a person has stopped actively searching for them. Clara had been sent to Lady Beatrice's private study to retrieve a particular volume of correspondence, and in reaching for it on a high shelf, she dislodged a small leather folder that had been tucked behind the books, spilling its contents across the study floor. She knelt to gather the scattered papers, intending only to restore them to their folder without examination, but her eye caught on a name that made her freeze entirely, her hand hovering above the page. It was a letter from Mr. Whitmore's office, addressed to Lady Beatrice, referencing arrangements made regarding, the letter read, the companion position recently secured for Miss Clara Bennet, at the specific instruction of His Grace, who wishes the matter to proceed exactly as previously discussed, with no indication whatsoever of his involvement to reach either the young lady or general society. Clara sat very still on the study floor, the letter trembling slightly in her hand, understanding crashing over her with the force of something long suspected finally confirmed. The man she had spoken with so easily at the harvest gathering, whose attention had felt so different from anything she had experienced before, had been the architect of her entire release, her entire new life, working quietly and invisibly behind every fortunate turn her circumstances had taken since that terrible morning, weeks before. She read the letter twice more, searching for any detail that might explain his reasons, but Whitmore's careful, professional language offered nothing beyond the bare fact of his involvement. Why would a duke, a man of such rank and consequence, take such careful, expensive interest in the fate of a merchant's disgraced daughter, and why would he go to such lengths to ensure she never learned the truth of it? She was still sitting there, papers scattered around her, when Lady Beatrice entered the study and found her, and something in the older woman's expression, a flash of alarm quickly suppressed, told Clara that Lady Beatrice understood immediately what had been discovered. "My dear," Lady Beatrice said carefully, "perhaps you had better sit down properly, rather than on the floor, amid my correspondence." Clara rose, still clutching the letter, her mind working furiously to arrange her scattered thoughts into some coherent question. This letter speaks of arrangements made at the Duke's instruction. "Regarding my position here, Lady Beatrice, please, I must know the truth of this." Lady Beatrice sighed, settling herself into a chair near the window with the air of a woman accepting an unavoidable conversation. "I had hoped this particular matter might remain undisturbed a while longer, though I confess, I always suspected your sharp eyes would eventually uncover it. Yes, my dear, it was my nephew who arranged your position here, at his own particular request, though he insisted most firmly that neither you nor society at large should ever learn of his involvement. And the debt," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The debt that was settled, the anonymous benefactor who paid £412 to free me from that terrible place. That was him as well, wasn't it?" Lady Beatrice's expression softened with something like sympathy. "I believe it was, though he has never spoken of the specific details to me. My nephew has always had a particular tendency toward quiet charity, my dear, extended to those he believes deserve better fortune than circumstance has offered them. He has never once sought recognition for such acts, and would, I imagine, be rather distressed to learn you have discovered his involvement in this particular matter." Clara sat down heavily in the chair opposite Lady Beatrice, the letter still clutched in her hand, a storm of conflicting emotions moving through her too quickly to properly sort. Gratitude, certainly, overwhelming and genuine, toward the man who had freed her from that terrible ward and given her the means to rebuild her life. But beneath the gratitude ran something sharper, something closer to wounded pride, the uncomfortable realization that every fortunate turn in her recent life had been, in truth, an act of secret charity rather than her own earned success, that she had unknowingly been the object of a stranger's pity all along. Why would he do such a thing, she asked finally, for someone he did not even know? Lady Beatrice was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight of old sorrow that Clara had not heard from her before. "My nephew lost a sister some years ago, my dear. Eleanor, a sweet girl, gentle in temperament, who suffered a great deal in her final illness, while much of our family, myself included to my everlasting shame, kept our distance out of a foolish fear of the unpleasantness of watching someone we loved decline. Nathaniel was abroad during her worst months, occupied with matters of business, and by the time he returned, it was very nearly too late to offer her any real comfort. He has carried that regret ever since, and I believe, though he has never said so directly, that he sees in cases such as yours an opportunity to correct, in some small measure, what he was unable to correct for his own sister. Clara absorbed this explanation slowly, feeling something in her chest loosen slightly, at the understanding that his kindness had not been mere pity, but something born of genuine, hard-earned compassion, a wound of his own that he had transformed into purpose, rather than allowing it to curdle into bitterness. "I must speak with him," she said finally. "I cannot simply continue accepting his generosity without acknowledging it directly, whatever his wishes on the matter. It would feel like a kind of dishonesty to sit across from him at dinner and pretend I do not know what he has done." "He may not receive that conversation easily," Lady Beatrice warned. "He has built rather elaborate walls around this particular habit of his, and I suspect he will not appreciate having those walls breached, however gently you intend to breach them." Clara had scarcely finished absorbing this revelation when a second, far more troubling piece of news reached Kendrick only days later, carried by an urgent letter from Mr. Whitmore that Lady Beatrice read with visibly growing alarm before summoning Clara to her study once more. "There is a difficulty," Lady Beatrice said, her earlier warmth replaced now by genuine concern. "It seems the man who once held a portion of your father's debt, a Mr. Silas Grant, has somehow learned of my nephew's involvement in settling the matter, and worse, has begun making inquiries suggesting he intends to use this knowledge for his own gain." Clara's blood ran cold. What sort of gain could he possibly hope for, now that the debt itself is fully settled? Whitmore believes Grant intends to threaten exposure, publicly connecting the Duke's name to a scandal involving a merchant's disgraced daughter, unless he is paid a substantial sum to remain silent. Such a connection, however innocent in truth, could prove deeply damaging to my nephew's political standing, and to your own reputation as well, Clara, should society construe the arrangement in the worst possible light. Clara felt the floor of her carefully rebuilt life tilting once more beneath her feet, the old familiar terror of circumstances beyond her control, rising up to threaten everything she had only just begun to reclaim. "We cannot allow this man to threaten either of us," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Not after everything that has already been endured." "No," Lady Beatrice agreed grimly, "we cannot. I shall write to my nephew at once. He must be made aware of this threat before Grant has opportunity to act upon it." As Lady Beatrice moved to her writing desk, already composing the urgent letter in her mind, Clara stood by the window staring out at the peaceful Kendrick grounds, feeling the fragile new life she had built there suddenly threatened by a danger she had thought long since left behind, in that cold debtor's ward. Silas Grant, it seemed, was not finished with the Bennett family's misfortune after all, and this time, his greed threatened to drag not only Clara, but the very man who had saved her into a scandal, from which neither might easily recover. She thought of Nathaniel's careful, deliberate discretion, the elaborate lengths he had gone to in order to protect her dignity and his own privacy alike, and she felt a fierce, protective determination rise within her, a resolve that surprised her with its intensity. Whatever Silas Grant intended, whatever threat he thought he could level against them, Clara found herself unwilling to simply stand by and watch it unfold, as she had once been forced to stand by, while her own fate was decided by others. This time, she resolved, she would have a hand in whatever came next. Nathaniel arrived at Kendrick within 2 days of receiving his aunt's urgent letter, riding through a cold, driving rain that seemed to match the grim urgency of his mood entirely. He found Clara waiting for him in the main hall, having refused Lady Beatrice's suggestion that she retire to her cottage while the matter was discussed among the family, insisting that whatever threat Silas Grant posed concerned her every bit as much as it concerned the Duke himself. "Miss Bennet," he said, and there was something raw in his expression that Clara had not seen during their easy conversation at the harvest gathering, a tension that spoke of genuine worry rather than mere social formality. "I understand you have learned of my involvement in your release, and I owe you an explanation I have long avoided giving." "There will be time enough for explanations," Clara said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "Once we have settled the more pressing matter of Mr. Grant's intentions, I have no wish to see either of us destroyed by a man whose only true talent lies in extracting profit from other people's suffering." Something flickered across Nathaniel's face, perhaps surprise at her directness, perhaps something closer to admiration. "You are remarkably composed, given the circumstances." "I have had considerable practice, these past months, in remaining composed while circumstances threaten to overwhelm me," Clara said. "I do not intend to abandon that skill now, when it is needed most." They convened in Lady Beatrice's study, along with Mr. Whitmore, who had traveled from London with fresh news of Grant's demands. The solicitor laid out the situation with careful precision, his expression grave. "Grant has sent word through an intermediary that he intends to publish an account of the matter in one of the more scandalous London papers within the week, unless he receives a payment considerably larger than the sum he originally forfeited. He frames the story as one of impropriety, suggesting a duke's suspicious generosity toward a young woman of no particular connection to his family carries implications neither of you would wish examined too closely by polite society." "The man is a coward and a leech," Nathaniel said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "He would rather manufacture scandal from an act of simple charity than accept that some men act from decency rather than calculation." "Regardless of the truth of the matter," Whitmore said carefully, "the appearance, once published, will be difficult to fully correct. Society delights in scandal far more readily than it accepts explanation. I fear paying him again will only teach him that such threats yield reliable profit, inviting further demands down the road, yet refusing to pay risks, the very exposure we have worked so hard to avoid." Clara had been listening closely to this exchange, and now she spoke, her voice carrying a clarity of purpose that drew every eye in the room toward her. "Then perhaps the answer lies in refusing to let him control the narrative at all. If Mr. Grant intends to publish a story implying scandal, why not ensure the true story reaches the appropriate ears first, told plainly and without shame, so that his manufactured version carries no weight when it arrives?" Nathaniel studied her with evident surprise. "You would have your own history laid open before all of society, rather than remain concealed as I had intended." "I have spent enough months being ashamed of circumstances that were never my doing," Clara said firmly. "My father's debts were not my failing. My time in that ward was not a mark against my character, whatever society might wish to believe. And your kindness, your grace, was an act of genuine compassion, not some scandalous impropriety requiring concealment. If Mr. Grant wishes to twist a true and honorable story into something shameful, then let us deny him that power by speaking the truth ourselves, plainly and without apology." A long silence followed her words, broken finally by Lady Beatrice's soft, approving laugh. "There, Nathaniel. I did tell you she possessed considerable spirit." Nathaniel's expression, as he continued to study Clara across the study, held something that went beyond mere admiration for her courage, something warmer and more complicated, that neither of them fully addressed in that crowded room, though both, perhaps, felt its presence keenly. "It is a bold course," he said finally, "but I confess, I find myself agreeing with it. Whitmore, draft a careful account of the matter, the debt, the settlement, my reasons for wishing anonymity, framed honestly and without embellishment. We shall see it delivered to the more respectable papers before Grant's scandalous version has opportunity to circulate." "And Grant himself," Whitmore asked. "What is to be done regarding his threat, once the true account has already reached the public?" Nathaniel's expression hardened. "Grant's entire scheme depends upon scandal having value. If we remove the scandal by speaking plainly first, his threatened story becomes nothing more than the bitter complaint of a man who lost a profitable debt through his own poor judgment. I do not believe such a story, told after the fact, will carry the weight he imagines." The following days passed in a flurry of careful activity, Whitmore drafting and redrafting the account with Clara's direct input, ensuring the story reflected her own voice and her own understanding of events, rather than simply the Duke's version of a charitable act performed upon a passive recipient. Clara found, in the process of shaping her own narrative, a measure of healing she had not expected, the simple power of telling her own story on her own terms, after so many months of having her fate decided entirely by others. When the account finally appeared in the London papers, It told a story rather different from the scandal Grant had hoped to manufacture. A tale of a young woman, abandoned by her own family in a debtor's ward, rescued through the quiet generosity of a benefactor who sought no recognition, and the courage of that same young woman in choosing, once the truth threatened to be twisted, to speak it plainly herself, rather than allow shame to be forced upon circumstances that held none. Society's reaction, when it came, proved surprisingly favorable, admiration for Clara's composure and honesty outweighing whatever appetite existed for scandal, and Nathaniel's reputation, rather than suffering as Grant had hoped, gained an unexpected dimension of quiet respect among those who valued genuine character over performed virtue. Silas Grant's threatened story, when it finally appeared some days later in a lesser paper willing to print it, fell entirely flat, arriving as it did after the true account had already shaped public opinion, and reading now as nothing more than the sour complaint of a disappointed profiteer, rather than the damning exposure he had intended. Whitmore reported, some weeks later, that Grant's business had suffered considerably from the affair, several of his other debtors emboldened by the example of Clara's public honesty to challenge his previously unquestioned methods. But it was the quieter aftermath of the crisis that mattered most to Clara, the evening following the paper's publication, when Nathaniel found her walking alone through Kendrick's gardens, the autumn air cool and clean after days of anxious tension. "You have given me a gift I did not expect," he said, falling into step beside her. "I had built my charity around careful concealment, believing anonymity the truest form of generosity. You have shown me something rather different, that sometimes the more courageous gift is simply speaking honestly, whatever the risk." "You gave me my freedom," Clara said. "It seemed only right that I should use it, once restored, to speak for myself, rather than remain silent and grateful in the shadows." They walked together in comfortable silence for a time, the events of the past weeks settling into something that felt, for the first time since her father's business had first begun to crumble, like solid ground beneath her feet. "I owe you an apology as well," Nathaniel said eventually, "for the elaborate deception I constructed around your release, however well-intentioned. You deserved honesty from the very beginning, rather than a carefully managed fiction of ordinary opportunity." "You were protecting me," Clara said. "I understand that now, even if I did not fully understand it when I first discovered the truth. But I would ask, going forward, that you trust me with honesty rather than protection alone. I have proven, I think, that I can bear difficult truths rather better than you perhaps first imagined." Nathaniel stopped walking and turned to face her fully, something earnest and unguarded in his expression that Clara had not seen from him before. "Then let me be entirely honest with you now, Clara Bennett, whatever the risk of speaking plainly. I did not settle your debt merely out of general charitable habit, nor solely in memory of my sister, though both played their part in my initial decision. I settled it because something in your bearing, glimpsed across that terrible courtyard, struck me in a way I could not fully explain even to myself, and that impression has only deepened with every subsequent hour I have spent in your company since." Clara felt her heart quicken at these words, spoken with a directness that matched her own newfound commitment to honesty over careful concealment. "Then we are agreed," she said softly, "that honesty, however frightening, serves us both rather better than the elaborate discretion we have each practiced until now." "We are agreed," Nathaniel said, and something in the autumn evening around them seemed to hold its breath as he reached for her hand, the gesture simple and yet carrying the full weight of everything they had each risked and revealed over these past extraordinary weeks. Winter had settled fully over Kendrick by the time Clara received the letter that would close, finally and completely, the long chapter of her family's betrayal. It came from her father, the first correspondence she had received from him since that terrible morning when the men in dark coats had stood in their hallway, deciding her fate without ever truly consulting her wishes. She read it alone in her cottage, by the light of a good fire, in a room that was now entirely her own in every sense that mattered. Her father wrote of shame, of regret that had grown heavier with each passing month rather than lighter, of having heard through mutual acquaintances, of her remarkable composure in the face of Silas Grant's attempted scandal, and of her subsequent connection to the Duke of Rendale. He asked, with a humility that might once have moved her deeply, whether she might find it in her heart to forgive him, to allow some manner of reconciliation between them. Clara sat with the letter for a long while, feeling for it an emotion far quieter than the anger she might once have expected to feel. She thought of Agnes, still in that ward as far as she knew, still waiting for a rescue that might never come. She thought of Hetty and her pale, quiet infant. She thought of every woman she had left behind, whose families had shown no more loyalty than her own had shown her, and who had no duke, no chance benefactor, to notice their suffering and quietly set it right. She wrote back to her father eventually, a careful letter that offered neither full forgiveness nor complete rejection, but something more honest than either, an acknowledgement that his choice had wounded her in ways that would take considerable time to heal, alongside a genuine hope that he might use whatever remained of his fortune and influence to help others still suffering in circumstances similar to her own, as a means of making some real amends beyond mere words. She enclosed, with the letter, a modest sum of her own earnings, along with instructions that it be directed towards securing Agnes's release from the ward, a small repayment of the debt of kindness she still carried in her heart. Her father wrote back within the month to confirm that Agnes Miller had indeed been released, the debt settled through funds Clara had provided, along with a contribution he had insisted on adding himself, perhaps the first genuinely selfless act Clara could recall from him in a very long time. Agnes wrote her own letter shortly after, full of gratitude and news of a small position she had secured as a housekeeper through a connection Lady Beatrice had graciously arranged, and Clara felt, reading it, a satisfaction deeper than any she had known since her ordeal began, the particular joy of having transformed her own suffering into someone else's rescue. The wedding, when it finally came the following spring, was a quiet affair by the standards of dukedoms, held in the small chapel at Kendrick rather than some grand London cathedral, attended by Lady Beatrice, by Agnes in her modest but respectable new clothes, by Whitmore and Pruitt standing together near the back with the particular satisfaction of men who had helped engineer a happy outcome through careful, patient work. Clara's mother attended as well, though her father did not, the wound between them not yet fully healed enough to bear his presence at such an occasion, though the correspondence between them continued, slow and careful, building something that might, in time, resemble genuine reconciliation rather than mere polite tolerance. Margaret sent a letter of congratulations that arrived a week late, careful and formal in its phrasing, and Clara read it without bitterness, understanding now that some relationships, once broken by cowardice, healed slowly if at all, and that peace sometimes meant accepting what could be repaired while releasing what could not. Standing at the altar in a simple gown that suited her far better than any elaborate finery might have, Clara looked at Nathaniel and thought of the long journey that had brought her to this moment, the cold morning when her father's betrayal had first delivered her into that terrible ward, the months of hardship and small survival lessons learned from Agnes, the strange stillness of a stranger's watching gaze across a muddy courtyard that had, in time, become the steady, loving presence now standing beside her. "I once told you," Nathaniel said quietly, as they exchanged their private vows before the more formal ceremony began, "that I had built my entire practice of charity around careful concealment, believing that true generosity required no acknowledgement. You have taught me something rather different, Clara, that the truest generosity often requires the courage to be known fully, flaws and history and all, rather than hidden away out of fear or shame. And you taught me," Clara replied, "that even in the darkest circumstances, someone might still choose to see worth in a person that their own family had failed to recognize. I carry that lesson with me still, and I intend to spend the whole of our life together, making certain others receive the same chance you once gave me, quietly, without need for recognition, but never again in secret from those it touches most directly." As they turned to face the small gathered assembly, husband and wife, now in the eyes of both church and society, Clara felt the last remnants of that cold debtor's ward finally release their hold upon her entirely. She was no longer the abandoned daughter, surrendered by her own family, to settle a debt she had never incurred. She was Clara Ashworth now, Duchess of Rendale, a woman who had walked through genuine darkness and emerged not merely rescued, but transformed, carrying forward into her new life a fierce determination to extend to others the same quiet, honest kindness that had once, against every reasonable expectation, found her in her lowest hour and refused to let her go. Outside the chapel, spring had come fully to Kendrick, the gardens bursting with the particular green optimism of new growth after a long winter's dormancy. And as Clara stepped out into that bright new season on her husband's arm, she allowed herself, finally and completely, to believe that whatever darkness had once threatened to define her entire existence had been transformed, through patience and honesty and an unexpected stranger's quiet courage, into something altogether better than mere survival. It had become, in the end, a genuine and hard-won happiness, built not on the ashes of her family's betrayal, but on the steady foundation of a truth finally spoken aloud, and a kindness finally allowed to be known.